There are times in every leader's life when they can choose to do the difficult thing, possibly to their own detriment, or sit back and just hope for the best. Those who take on the mantle of peacemaker lead with courage and often at their own personal risk. This is Abigail.
Well, welcome to part 3 of a series we've been calling Prayers for Our Next President. Now, I don't know if you've been with us the past few weeks, but this whole series is anchored in this idea of something that Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote to the man that he was mentoring, a guy by the name of Timothy. It's recorded for us in the book that we now call 1 Timothy in the Bible, where Paul tells us that we should pray for everyone, and then specifically calls out we should pray for our governmental leaders, and even mentions kings of the day, which would have been the highest level of leadership in that day. And though the word president is not used, if Paul was writing to us today, he might insert the term president, that we should be praying for our president, maybe praying for the next president. Now, the truth is, in my own life, and I don't know if your life is anything like mine, I've found a lot of conviction as I've been preparing for this series and even preparing for today, that oftentimes I find myself more critical of our political leaders rather than prayerful about our political leaders. Am I alone in that? That sometimes I find myself so critical but not prayerful enough. And so the heartbeat of this series is to lean into that biblical command, and that us as a church would join together and that we would be prayerful about whoever it is that God puts as the president of our country in this next season. And as we do so, we're praying for these different character traits, these qualities that God might really interweave into their hearts, their lives, and their leadership. And so week 1 of the series, we talked about integrity, and that we're praying prayers of integrity for our next president. Last week, if you were here, we talked about humility, and we are praying prayers of humility for our next president. Today, we're going to talk about this idea that God would somehow help them become what we're going to call a courageous peacemaker. Now, throughout this series, this is not just about us praying for that leader. It's also about praying the same prayer for us. The truth is, we want our next president to be somebody of integrity, but we're also praying that God helps us become that as well. We want our next president to become somebody of humility, but we're also praying that God would wire that in us as well. We want our next president to be a courageous peacemaker. But my prayer is that becomes true of your life, that becomes true of my life as well. I mean, how many of us would say we would love a little more peace in our lives and in this world? Anybody? I think probably for all of us, right? We all want more peace in our world, but I would argue we all want more peace in our own personal lives as well. It's something that's deep within us. And yet Jesus actually calls us out. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most famous message, kind of the introduction, we now call it the Beatitudes, he talks about people who are blessed. It's like, blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are the meek, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Then he gets toward the end, he says this, he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who make peace. Now, the word peace would have been a very familiar term in this ancient Jewish culture. It's derived from the ancient Hebrew word. Maybe you've heard it spoken before. The ancient Hebrew word for peace is what? Shalom. Turn to somebody near you. Tell them, shalom. Shalom. Now, what's interesting about this word, shalom, is it's not just the absence of fighting. You know, sometimes when we think about peace, we just, man, would you guys just knock it off? Would you just kind of keep the peace? It's not just the absence of fighting, it's actually also the presence of flourishing. It's like the fighting is stopped and beautiful living can really flourish and can really begin. And Jesus says, blessed are those that help facilitate that kind of peace in our world and in our lives. But here's the truth. You and I experience conflict all the time. Like, we live in a world that is riddled with conflict. You can experience conflict without looking for conflict, and certainly there are those who look for conflict and they also find it as well. But conflict is inevitable, it's everywhere. I would go as far to say that every meaningful relationship that's ever existed at some point has experienced some sort of conflict. So the question becomes, like, what do we do in seasons of conflict? Now, oftentimes, we don't take a peacemaking route. Oftentimes, we fall into one of two categories. And I would say in this political cycle, both these categories are alive and well right now. You see them both on social media and in your interpersonal relationships. I would say the first way people tend to deal with conflict is I would say they are kind of a warrior type mentality, right? They're the people who kind of go after the issues. Now, I would say this, before we talk about warrior, I would say that the peace ultimately plummets when two things happen. When rights are infringed or relationships become unhinged. And that has to be true because I worked really hard to make those rhyme. Peace plummets when rights are infringed or relationships become unhinged. Now, what happens oftentimes in conflict, again, is people will take one of two postures, neither of which is peacemaking. The first, what I was describing earlier, is kind of this warrior-type mentality. This is the person that goes after what is right, but sometimes does so at the expense of the relationship. It's typically when the right becomes infringed, they want to make it right. They want to declare what is right. They want everybody else to know what is right. They go after it. They tackle it. Sometimes they can be somewhat aggressive about it, right? That's kind of the warrior-type mentality. The difficulty of the warrior-type mentality is the byproduct oftentimes can be a broken relationship. Now, you probably think about somebody that comes to mind who ends up fighting for whatever the conviction is that they believe in, and you can see sometimes the relational carnage that's behind their lives. Like there's a trail of that in their wake, right? And so we know that, we understand that, we experience that, and oftentimes warriors actually aren't able to convince somebody of their position because the old adage is true. People don't care about what you believe until they believe that you care. People don't care about what you believe until they believe that you care. And so warriors can fight for the thing that they feel like is right, but they can do so at the expense of a relationship, and in that, there is no peace. There are others that take a different route. They don't go the warrior route, they go the avoider route. And so they so badly want to preserve the relationship that they avoid the issue altogether. They like brush it under the rug. We just don't even talk about it. We act like it doesn't exist, that if we can avoid it altogether, we can preserve the relationship. But I would argue that it actually doesn't bring about peace because the conflict is never addressed. The conflict continues to fester and grow over the course of time. And I will tell you, for the avoider, there is also no peace. What's fascinating about Thanksgiving is we put the warriors and avoiders around the same Thanksgiving table, and it's a free-for-all, isn't it? And we know that. That's why we say, like, we can't talk about politics around the Thanksgiving table. Why? It's because oftentimes you have a mix of warriors and avoiders, and it's a mess because it's not the way of peace. I would argue that neither warriors nor avoiders have the ability to bring about peace because when Jesus talks about a peacemaker, they go a very different route. Now, what's fascinating about the word peacemaker, it's a compound word even in the ancient language. It has two meanings in one word. It's kind of similar to other words like in the English language that have two meanings to the same word. So words like rom-com. Is it a romance? Or is it a comedy? Or is it both, right? Or something like staycation. Am I sticking around? Or am I going on vacation? Or am I doing both? Or something like athleisure. It's like when you wear this certain thing, am I going to the gym? Or am I sitting on the couch eating bonbons, watching the TV? It could be either, right? So these are kind of words that mean two different things. Peacemaker is also one of those things. It actually reflects the fundamental meaning of shalom that we talked about. It's somebody who can bring about a resolution to the conflict while at the same time bringing flourishing to the equation. It's not just the absence of fighting, it's the presence of flourishing. It's the person that has the ability to facilitate both. It's the person who restores what is right and honors the relationship at the same time. Blessed are the peacemakers. And so our prayer for our next president and our prayer for our own lives is that God would weave into our character this ability to be a peacemaker. Can you imagine what it would be like if there were more peacemakers in our homes, in our places of work, in our schools, in the places that we go? Can you imagine what it would be like to have a peacemaker in a position like the President of the United States that can step into some of the biggest conflicts on the biggest stages with the greatest stakes and have the ability to actually address the conflict, but do so in a way that preserves people and brings about peace? Not just the absence of fighting, but the flourishing of people and cultures and lands. Wouldn't that be a God-sized dream and vision for the person to hold? So talking a little bit more about peacemaking, I want to take us to a narrative in Scripture that probably is not familiar to a lot of us. It's in the Old Testament, the Bible, book of 1 Samuel chapter 25. And so if you got a Bible, you can go to 1 Samuel 25. If not, the words will show up on the screen as well. It's this fascinating story about this incredible woman named Abigail. Now, before we get into Abigail's part of the story, you got to know about a few other players in the narrative. There's a guy by the name of Nabal. He's Abigail's husband. Now, Nabal, man, he's a knucklehead. I mean, like, total knucklehead. He's got the people skills of a rock. I mean, he's just not a good person. He's not a good dude. He's not somebody who probably makes a lot of friends. He's somebody who probably makes a lot of enemies. He's somebody that like will rub you the wrong way. Now Nabal's a pretty wealthy guy. He owns a lot of the fields. He is a farmer. In wealth in that day was often measured by your harvest and the amount of grain that you had. It was also measured in your livestock, which he also had a ton of. So he had a lot of sheep, a lot of cattle, that kind of stuff. Very wealthy man. Now, he lived in the same territory of a guy that maybe you're a little bit more familiar with, a guy by the name of David, the guy who would become King David. Greatest king Israel ever knew before Jesus. Now, what's interesting is David in this story, in 1 Samuel chapter 25, David is not yet king, and so Nabal and David live in the same territory. And so Nabal, against the farmer, he's the rancher, he's the wealthy guy in the area. What David was doing at the time is he was kind of the security of the area. So David and his men, they patrolled the hills and the valleys. They made sure everybody stayed safe and secure. If there was an enemy invading, David and his men would take care of that enemy invader, protecting people like Nabal, protecting his crops, protecting his livestock, protecting his wealth. David played a critical role in Nabal's success. Well, when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 25, you see it's harvest season. Nabal just harvested a lot of the crops. They sheared a lot of the sheep. It was a time to celebrate the bountiful harvest that they just experienced. And so Nabal throws this massive feast. There was a feast fit for a king. It was incredible. Now David hears about it. And not only does he hear about it, he feels like he and his men deserve an invitation, right? I mean, after all, he had kind of protected the area. Now, that's kind of the backdrop of the story as we're going to dive into a conflict and ultimately a peacemaking opportunity. But here's what we got to know about peacemakers. Here's the first principle about peacemaking. The peacemaking requires understanding. Peacemaking requires understanding. And so here's basically what happens. David sends a few of his men, servants, to go to Nabal, basically ask an invitation to this party. Here's how it plays out. Verse 6. They start off very kindly. Peace and prosperity to you, your family, and everything you own. Sounds very kind. The servant says, I'm told that it's sheep shearing time. While your shepherds stayed near us, near Carmel, we never harmed them. Nothing was ever stolen from them. In other words, we did a really good job protecting you and everything that you own. I mean, you can ask your own men. They'll tell you that this is true. So would you be kind to us? Since we come at a time of celebration, would you please share any provisions that you might have on hand with us and your friend David? It feels like a reasonable request, doesn't it? I mean, they've kind of been taking care of Nabal from afar, ensuring that everything that he had was protected and guarded. He's like, you can ask your men for yourself that everything has gone just the way that I described it. Well, here is Nabal's response to this request. Who is this fellow David? As if he doesn't know. Like, who is this fellow David? Nabal sneered to the young men. Who does this son of Jesse think he is? So apparently he does know David because he knows the name of his dad. So who does this son of Jesse think he is? There's lots of servants these days who've run away from their masters. Should I take my bread, my water, my meat that I've slaughtered for my shearers? Could he say my even more one more time, right? I mean, am I gonna take like everything that is mine and give it to a band of outlaws who comes from who knows where? Well done, Nabal. He basically says, everything is mine and I'm not sharing nothing with nobody at any moment of any time. You can tell David to kiss off. That's a loose translation of what happened, right? He's like, you can tell him to take a hike. Like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going there. I'm not sharing a single thing with him. Now, David, when those messengers come back, felt disrespected, felt pushed aside, felt like that was incredibly unreasonable. And look at David's response. It said, so David's young men returned and told him what Nabal had said. Look at David's first response. Get your swords. What was David's reply as he strapped on his own sword? Then 400 men started off with David and 200 remained behind to guard their equipment. Well, that escalated quickly, right? Like, holy smokes. I mean, David feels disrespected, he feels disregarded, and he goes, those are fighting words. Grab your swords. Let's go take them out. And isn't it fascinating how that's sometimes the human response when we feel disrespected, we feel harmed in some way, we feel criticized in some way. Our initial response is, if you harm me, I'm gonna harm you just a little bit more. If you said something mean-spirited to me, I'm gonna say something mean-spirited to you, and maybe a little bit more. You disrespected me, I'm gonna disrespect you, and maybe a little bit more. And what happens typically is this escalation when it comes to conflict. We see it in our homes, we see it on a global scale. Like what's happening right now in the Middle East is this incredible escalation of conflict. Because that typically is the natural human response. Now, I will tell you, when I'm at my healthiest and relational best, I tend to work toward diffusing conflict. And I wish I did that every time. But I'm as guilty as anybody when I'm not at a healthy place or when I get really offended or wounded. I've also been known to escalate situations, and I would say unnecessarily so. We've all been there. We've all experienced it, right? That we've been harmed, and so we harm. I mean, hurt people tend to hurt people. Kind of on a funnier note, I remember in college, every now and then prank wars would break out in our dorm room. Maybe you experienced something like this. And I remember this one in particular. There was this guy who snuck into another guy on the floor of his room and took every piece of white clothing that he owned. And he took, shirts, socks, underwear, you name it. And he washed them all with this bright red towel, turning every white article of clothing pink, and then returned them to the guy's room. Now, he thought it was pretty funny, and the guy who now had all pink laundry did not find it quite as funny, and so he thought he would get back at the guy for doing what he did to him. So what he did is he went to the store and he bought out almost every toothbrush that Walmart had at the time. He came back to the dorm, he took all the bristles out of the toothbrush and put it all over the guy's bed, knowing that he would never be able to find all the bristles and get them all out. Well, that obviously enraged somebody that now is sleeping on bristles, and no matter how many times he washed his sheets, he could never get it fully clean, and so he decided to respond. And what he did, it was around the Easter time frame, and so he went and he bought, you know those baby chicks that they sometimes sell around Easter time? And he bought out every store that he could find that still had baby chicks, and he put those baby chicks all over this guy's room, in drawers, on his bed, in his coffee pot, everywhere. And little chicks, after they've eaten a little bit, deposit the digested things that the chicks have eaten. And so that was everywhere, all over this guy's room. It was disgusting. And in a moment of rage, this guy then goes back to Walmart and every other store he could find, and now it's post-Easter, and all the Easter grass, that you put in baskets, was on sale. And he bought out every store of the Easter basket grass and buried his dorm room about 3 feet deep in Easter grass. Now, I can laugh about that now looking back on it. But what's fascinating is that's sometimes how we operate, right? Something happens, and so I'm gonna do something to you a little bit more, and then that happened and that offended you, so I'm gonna do something a little bit more, and it just escalates and escalates and escalates and escalates, and that's what's going on in 1 Samuel chapter 25. There's this escalation based on offense that has happened. And again, what happens in a dorm room happens in our living room, and it also happens on a global scale. I don't envy whoever the president is stepping into some of the biggest, most complicated, most deep-seated conflicts that this world has ever known. I do not underestimate what it looks like to step into situations that have already escalated to places that's hard to begin to manage. And what does it look like for us to pray on behalf of our next president that they could step into these unbelievably challenging and difficult situations as a peacemaker on God's behalf, not just ensuring the absence of fighting, but restoring flourishing for all those who get to experience it. If we want to be peacemakers, the first thing, we have to understand what the actual conflict is. The second piece of it is this: peacemakers have this way of stepping up in conflict. They step up in conflict. This is where Abigail is introduced to the story. There was one of Nabal's servants. He heard what Nabal had said to David's men, and he kind of had this assumption, that's not gonna sit very well with David. David's likely gonna come back, and it ain't gonna be pretty if he comes back. And so the servant tips Nabal's wife, her name was Abigail, off to what was playing out. And what's fascinating is she immediately sprung into action. Look what it says, verse 18. It says, Abigail wasted no time. I love that statement. Abigail, you'll find out, she's not a warrior, but she's not an avoider either. She was willing to dive headfirst into the conflict that she didn't even create. And so it says that she wasted no time. Look what she did. She gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 wineskins full of wine, 5 sheep that had been slaughtered, nearly a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 fig cakes, and she packed them on a donkey, and she said to her servants, go on ahead, I will follow you shortly. I love what's happening in this moment. She pulls together a bounty likely larger than what David was originally asking for in the first place. And is looking to be even generous and bless David beyond what he was initially asking him for. But don't miss the powerful details of this moment in the story. Abigail is putting her own life on the line as she goes literally by herself as a female in the ancient world, riding on a donkey with a couple of servants to meet a bloodthirsty group of 400 people that are out to kill every member of her family. What an intimidating moment. What incredible courage to step into a moment when she could not be guaranteed any kind of outcome. What we learn about what was in David's heart before the encounter happens, you find it in verse 22. Here's David speaking about himself in the third person. He says, may God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. He's ready to kill everybody. And yet this is the dynamic that she steps into. It's incredible courage. It's a willingness to sacrifice herself for the sake of a greater cause or greater plan. She's not a warrior, but she's not an avoider. She was willing to put herself at stake for the sake of what was great stakes. It was not lost on her that she was the last line of defense for every member of her household. It was not lost on her that so many were depending on her. And what we'll find out in just a moment is she became this incredible, incredible peacemaker. It kind of reminds me of another peacemaker, a guy by the name of Nelson Mandela. I'm sure you're familiar with this story. But back in the 1970s, under apartheid in South Africa, the minority controlling government was forcing everybody to learn their language, and there was a group of people that simply refused, particularly young people that refused. And because they refused, they actually were jailed for not being willing to learn the language of the controlling minority. Yet while in prison, Nelson Mandela committed to learning the language of his enemy. Not only the language, he committed himself to learn the culture, learn more about who they are, learn, why did they do what they do? He took all kinds of criticism from his fellow prisoners for doing what he was doing. But he was committed to it. He says, if we're ever going to build a bridge, if we're ever going to create peace, the only way to do so is to bring understanding by which we can build a bridge under the surface level issues. It is the only way. And as you know, it was decades later that God used him to facilitate peace in a way that the country had never known. Peacemakers are not afraid to engage and to step into situations. Peacemakers, they have to have an understanding. They have to have a willingness to step in. But what we also find out about peacemakers is peacemaking calls us to look beyond today. In other words, peacemakers, they see a greater narrative, what really matters more even beyond the moment. When Abigail finally arrives to the presence of David, she quickly begins to share a plea with him that is worthy of a couple of paragraphs in the Bible. It's kind of a beautiful thing. You see it in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 23. It says this: when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey, bowed before him. She fell at his feet and said, look what she says, "I accept all blame in this matter, my Lord. Please listen to what I have to say. I know Nabal is a wicked, ill-tempered man. Please don't pay him any attention. He's a fool." Just as his name suggests, Nabal literally meant fool in the ancient language, and he lived up to his name. It says, "But I never even saw the young men that you sent." Now notice what she does. The first thing that she does is she respects David. She shows him respect. She bows before him. She calls him Lord. She calls herself a servant. She is incredibly respectful in this moment. The second thing she does is she takes full responsibility for a conflict that she didn't create. She didn't do it. She didn't say it. She didn't even know about it until somebody told her later. Yet when she gets in David's presence, the first thing she said is, "I accept all the blame in this matter." She takes it on herself in order to ensure a different outcome. But the third thing that she does is she calls her husband what he was. He's a fool. Now, she's not saying that in a disrespecting way, but if you're really going to be a peacemaker, you have to call a spade a spade. You actually have to speak what is actually true. And so the comments are not disrespectful comments, but she has to speak truth. If she doesn't acknowledge what's actually true, there's no way that the conflict will ever be reconciled. And what's amazing in this moment, in this quick little interchange, her posture turns away the river of anger that David was carrying into the moment. An apology totally diffused the entire situation. Her kindness bent David's heart in a new direction. And after that, she switches gears and she actually calls David to see beyond the moment. Like, I know that you're bloodthirsty because of what just happened in this moment, but God actually has something bigger in mind for you. She knew that he was anointed as king. She knew that he was going to be king, and she called him to be the king that he would become instead of the victim that he felt in the moment. When you operate as a victim in the moment, you'll never be able to be a peacemaker. And so she calls him not to be what he is in the moment, but what God ultimately called him to be, raises his eyes to a greater story. Here's what she says next. She says, even when you're chased by those who seek to kill you, your life is safe in the care of the Lord your God, secure in his treasure pouch. But the lives of your enemies will disappear like stones shot from a sling. You gotta love that. She's like, remember when you slayed that giant? Come on. God's not done doing that kind of stuff in your life. And then he says, when the Lord has done all he promised and has made you leader of Israel, don't let this be a blemish on your record. Then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance. And when the Lord has done these great things for you, please remember me as your servant. Do you see what she's doing? She's like, David, I know you feel like a victim in the moment. But God didn't call you to be a victim. He called you to be the king. Start acting like the king. And if you're acting like the king, when you become king, you don't want needless bloodshed on your conscience or on your resume. That doesn't serve you or anybody well. Do you see what she's doing? She's not a warrior, but she's not an avoider. She's a peacemaker. And because of that, not only will she facilitate an absence of fighting, she will also facilitate lives that begin to flourish. Look at David's response. Thank God for your good sense. Bless you for keeping me from murder and from carrying out vengeance with my own hands. For I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, has kept me from hurting you, that if you had not hurried out to meet me, not one of Nabal's men would still be alive tomorrow morning. Then David accepted her present. He told her, return home in peace. I have heard what you said. We will not kill your husband. It's a beautiful picture of what peacemaking looks like. I mean, peacemakers, they understand the root of the conflict. They're willing to step up and step into the conflict, but they also call us to a higher and to a grander story. And what happens in response to that, not only is the absence of fighting, it's the presence of flourishing. This week I ran across a story that I didn't know before. A guy by the name of Daryl Davis, fascinating story. There's actually a documentary that was done on his life that is a fascinating documentary. I couldn't recommend it more highly. But if you know anything about Daryl Davis was a jazz musician. He played with some of the biggest names on some of the biggest stages. And as he did so, he was kind of known for his jazz musicianship, but when he wasn't playing jazz, what he did for a hobby, he was a black man that befriended members of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I know what I just said is a startling statement, because I remember hearing his story and I was startled by his posture. And what I learned as I leaned more and more into his life is he wasn't a warrior, but nor was he a avoider. He was a peacemaker unlike most anything you've ever seen in this world. That he would literally make friends with the members of the Ku Klux Klan. And in doing so, over the course of 30 years, there were 200 members of the KKK that handed him their robes and stepped out of their membership of this horrific organization. But I was really caught by one interview that he did with NPR. And I actually want to read the interview because I found it to be so powerful. He's talking about his experience in doing this, and he tells this story. This is the story he tells. He said this guy that he was connecting with was an exalted Cyclops, which is a leader in the Klan. He said he was sitting in my car in the passenger seat. He made a statement which I had heard before. He said, we all know that all black people have within them a gene that makes them violent. I turned to him and I'm driving and I said, wait a minute. I'm as black as anybody that you've ever seen. I've never done a carjacking. I've never done drive-by, so how do you explain that? He says he didn't even pause to think about it. He said, your gene is latent. It just hasn't come out yet. So how do you argue with somebody who's so far out in left field? He said, I was dumbfounded. I'm just driving along and he's sitting over there all smug and secure, like, see, you have no response. And I thought about it for a minute, and then I used his point of reference and I said, well, we know that all white people have a gene within them that makes them a serial killer. He says, what? What do you mean? And I said, well, name 3 black serial killers. He thought about it, and he couldn't do it. I quickly said, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy. All whites, I said. Son, you are a serial killer. He says, Daryl, I've never killed anybody. And I said to him, your gene is latent. It just hasn't come out yet. He goes, well, that's stupid. I said, well, duh, yes. But you know what? You're right. What I said was stupid. But no more stupid than what you said to me. He got very, very quiet and changed the subject. 5 months later, based on that conversation, he left the Klan. His robe was the first robe I ever got. That's the role of a peacemaker. It's not a warrior. It's not an avoider. It's someone who takes a third way to actually heal a conflict, to restore flourishing. That's our prayer for our next president. That's my prayer for you, and it's my prayer for me. And if you've been with us throughout the series, you know we've created a response after every single week of the series that we are literally writing out prayers to God on behalf of our next president. And every single week we're collecting these prayers, and we have thousands and thousands of them now. And our plan is to filter through them, making sure they all represent the heart of God and the heart of our church. And that those that do, we're going to mail to the White House after January 20th to whoever it is who's our next president. Because we believe that the collective prayers of thousands and thousands of people, that maybe, just maybe, God might do something special in the heart of our next leader. And we're committed to that outcome. Some of the prayers that people have written are beautiful. Can I share one with you? This was from last week. Somebody wrote this: Dear President, you were trusted and you were loved, not just by the American people, but by God, to do what is right. I can only imagine the infinite criticism and pressure and pain that you will suffer through, but through it all, your power is a vessel of hope to bring unity, peace, and humility to this world. Stay humble and strong in your capacity of compassion through this journey, which God has set you to embark on. Signed, a high schooler. And so I want to take us through the exercise. We've been doing this for a few weeks. If you haven't been with us the previous few weeks, then I'm going to invite you to do that for the first time. You can take that card that you received when you walked in and the pen that's in your hand, and I would encourage you to write a prayer to God. Maybe it's about peacemaking or whatever else God puts in your heart, a prayer on behalf of the next president. We'll take a few minutes to do that. Again, as I mentioned, our heart will be to gather these together. I would encourage you, don't write a name. Again, don't write anything that doesn't represent the heart of God, and those that honor that, we will mail these to the White House after January the 20th. I'm going to give you a moment to write out that prayer. you can continue to write the notes if you're still writing them. Once you're done at the end of the service, you can hand them to an usher on your way out today. But we also wanted to take a time together to celebrate communion together as a church. So hopefully you also received the elements of communion when you walked in. As I think about communion, what's fascinating is Abigail, in many ways, foreshadowed the person of Jesus. And it's kind of an interesting statement, right? Because Abigail lived 1,000 years before Jesus walked the face of this earth. She technically never knew Jesus. But yet there was so much about her that embodied the character of Christ. You could say that Abigail stepped into a situation. She actually stepped in between David and Nabal, and she stepped in between to make peace. In many ways, Jesus, he also stepped into a moment, and stepped into a moment between us and God, bringing peace. You think about Abigail. Abigail was willing to take responsibility for something that she didn't do for the sake of peace reigning in the situation. And in many ways, Jesus did the same thing. On the cross, he took responsibility of all of our sin, which he did not do, to help facilitate peace for all of us to experience. You could say through Abigail's actions, she turned away the anger of David, facilitating a peace that wouldn't have been able to experience otherwise. And I would say in the same way, the work of Christ turned the anger of God away so that you and I could experience peace, not only in this life, but for all eternity. As we think about the elements of communion, this is something we do as followers of Jesus. If you're a follower of Jesus, I would invite you to participate in this communion. We remember the work of Christ, the amazing, incredible work that stood in between, that took on our sin, that turned away anger so that you and I would experience peace. As we hold this bread, we remember the body of Christ that was given for us. Let's take the bread together. As we hold the cup of juice, we remember the blood of Christ that was given for us. Let's take the cup together. Jesus, we're grateful that just like Abigail, you came as a peacemaker. Not to just create the absence of conflict, but to make present this opportunity to thrive under your guide and your direction. Jesus, thank you for stepping in. Thank you for taking on sin that you didn't deserve, but turning away anger so that we'd experience peace. God, we love you. We thank you for Jesus. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.